I'd like to thank the General Thoracic Surgery Club for the opportunity to present our work. Here we're discussing robotic versus VATS lobectomies, propensity match comparison of outcomes, looking at high volume surgeons, and again using the Premier database. And so disclosures, two of us are consultants or speakers for Intuitive Surgical. Two of the other co-authors are research coordinators at Intuitive, just for full disclosure, and they're not listed here, but on the previous slide. So background, there are a lot of studies that have come out over the last 5 years looking at robotic lobectomy, but most of those include the learning curve time, and I think that confounds a lot of the data, looking at things like operative time, things like cost, and other outcomes. So we wanted to do something that tries to eliminate the learning curve aspect of it. I know that Dave Rice just talked about the open lobectomy versus robotic trial, and we're going to plan on participating in that. But I'll be honest that I think that looking at open lobectomy versus a minimally invasive lobectomy is a little bit late. I mean, we're not talking about open cholecystectomy versus laparoscopic cholecystectomy anymore. I think there are different modalities, there are different pros and cons, and looking at just open versus any minimally invasive, I think the minimally invasive approach is going to have shorter length of stay. The pain data is out there that's better. So, so here we wanted to really focus on VATS and robotics. And then there's obviously a critical need to look at that in experienced surgeons. And so here we looked at the Premier database, which is an administrative database of 700 hospitals encompassing approximately 20% of inpatient discharges in the United States. Over the time period that we looked at from 2011 to roughly 2015, there were approximately almost 24,000 elective lobectomies performed. And then we wanted to compare the number of robotic lobectomies compared in that time, almost 3,000, versus VATS lobectomies, just over 9,000. Here we wanted to look at patients from high volume surgeons, and in that case we defined surgeons whose volume of robotic or VATS was greater than 20 cases of that specific kind per year in that hospital. And we felt by doing that we're going to eliminate a lot of the people who are learning and a lot of the people who are dabbling in that. And you can see here, once we restricted those numbers to the high volume surgeons, there was only about 1,200 robotics cases and about double in VATS. Then doing propensity score matching using age, gender, race, comorbidity scores, including about 30 variables, and malignancy. We ended up with 1,166 patients in each group in the robotics and the VATS comparison groups. This is just a flow diagram kind of outlining the numbers I just talked about. But in the top, you can see again the 24,000 elective lobectomies, surgeon volume when we looked at greater than 20 in each case, and then after propensity score matching. Again, so that's not 1,166 total, that's 1,166 in each group, just to be clear. So this is the demographics in the propensity score matched groups. So again, you can see 1166 on the top. For this is the actual variables that were used to match patients. We didn't put the comorbidity scores in there just because it was too much, but you can see that there are similar number of patients in terms of age range, gender, distribution, race, and then indications for surgery being the majority being malignancy. We did not match the groups for these other factors in terms of hospital factors, in terms of location or payer mix, just because when we did try and do that, the numbers were reduced dramatically. And so we left this out for right now and for this comparison, but you can see that the robotics group is on the left. So there was a greater number of robotics cases performed in the South, probably all in Birmingham. He's not even here this year that joke is going to be that effective, and he would take credit for it, actually, so that's the other problem with that joke. But anyway, a majority of them were performed in academic centers compared to the VATS cases, and then a higher number of robotic cases were performed in larger hospitals with greater than 500 beds. So in terms of clinical outcomes, on the top here we have OR time in terms of the mean time. So the mean time for the robotics cases was greater than the VATS times. It's about 24 minutes when you look at the mean, about 27 minutes when you look at the median. The conversion rate, and this is interesting, I think that there was some data presented by Dave Rice yesterday or maybe on Thursday, was higher in the VATS cases. And this was statistically significant. You can see 4.7% versus 7.7%. And I think that this is probably the take-home message from this, is that there appears to be a slightly higher conversion rate. And we've seen this in doing the data analysis in a couple different ways. But again, this is for high-volume surgeons, greater than 20 cases per year. Blood transfusion rates were similar, both intraoperative and then also during the hospitalization and postoperatively. Length of stay was similar here, 6.3 versus 6.24 days in both groups. And discharge status in terms of whether or not they went home versus a healthcare facility was also similar. So again, I think, and the mortality also was similar, 1.15 versus 1.029, which I think are nominal differences. In terms of complication rates, I put on the left here just because we looked at a lot of complications. There was no differences in intra-op bleeding, transfusion rates, iatrogenic injury, bronchopleural fistula, empyema, pneumonia, chylothorax, and wound complications. But when you looked at all the complications together, there was a higher rate of complications in the VATS group, 38% versus 32.5%. And for both the 30-day complications as well as the intraoperative complications. There was a slightly higher rate of what was defined as index hospital postoperative bleeding, and that's defined by whether or not a person was felt to had anemia put on their discharge paperwork. So that's an administrative one, and so, but just to highlight and explain what that is there was, again, no difference, though, in terms of transfusion rates. And then there was a difference noted in pulmonary embolism. The numbers are fairly small. You can see it's 4 in the robotic cohort, 18 in the VATS cohort, but it did reach statistical significance in terms of the numbers. So in conclusion, robotics has a longer OR time than VATS. That, I think, is well established. Here in this administrative database, it appears to be only about 24 to 27 minutes. Robotics appears to have a lower conversion to open rate than VATS. It's small, but not insignificant, I think, in terms of almost a 3% difference. And then, at least in this database, robotics also has lower overall complication rates than VATS. And again, here is the 30-day complication rates listed. One of the things that I think we're wondering is, could that complication rate be related to the conversion rate? Is that 3% responsible for some of these differences? There are a number of limitations, obviously, with this study. This is an administrative database. We don't have any long-term outcome data. We don't have any pathology or staging information. And that there obviously is a clear, maybe a bias towards larger academic centers and the robotics cohort that may be related to outcomes. So I'm happy to take any questions.
Todd Demme at Buffalo. Well, I would think that you should also cite the other major bias, which is what they've seen when they look at the European databases, is really you don't have an index of two things. One, the centrality of the tumor. So you could easily explain the higher conversion rate because the VATS programs have been around longer, they're more mature, they're pushing their VATS reliability rates for advanced stage tumors up to the higher stages, the patients with essential tumors, and they're going to be therefore converting more. So you really, I think, if you're going to allocate your patients, it should be based on the total reliability for VATS, or minimally invasive reliability of that program, meaning the percentage of all the lobes they do that are done minimally invasive. If they're doing the easy cases by robot and then opening everyone else that's central, then you're going to see that result. And I think that's how you should try to proportion it, allocate it in the future. Some sort of centrality index or the total proportion of cases that are being done at that institution by minimally invasive. Thank you.
So I think that's a great point. I think that is something that's a little bit of a potential confounder in the minimally invasive versus open data set, especially here where we don't have staging information. At least for in my practice, I don't view robotic or VATS differently in terms of centrality of tumor. So that I think that our thought process was that these are minimally invasive approaches that are going to be similar in terms of what you're going to approach versus open. At least that was the thought process, and so we thought that those were more comparable groups. But other surgeons may have different thoughts on that.
I thought it was a great talk. I was wondering, like, Todd, if you had any information on stage. Like for
we
me,
don't. Yeah.
I don't operate without a camera, so even if I start everything VATS, and you do a lot of the dissection for those of us who do a lot of it, and I'm learning robotics, but I can't imagine that I would go through all that effort of bringing the robot in if I know I'm going to need to do some central dissection.
No, that's a great point. I think that the ideal situation would be look for early stage tumors where you have a true comparison, and that's definitely a limitation of the study. So.
And then do you know why 10% in each group didn't have lung cancer?
I don't know. We've talked about that. It's higher than I would have expected. I agree with that. There are some definitions in terms of the database, things like what's an elective lobectomy versus an emergent lobectomy. The emergent lobectomy rate was actually 3 to 5%, I think, if I remember correctly, which is, we didn't look at those, but again, I'm not sure what an emergent lobectomy is and how it's that high a number. That was another question in terms of why was there such a higher number, we felt, in terms of the non-cancer indications.
Thank you.
But we don't have the answer to that.
Keith Mortman, Washington, D.C. Thank you for presenting your data. The question I have is, and then I don't know if you have the answer because of the database that you used, but the conversions, obviously the VATS conversions were to open, but the robotic conversions, it'd be nice to know if they were to traditional VATS or if they were converted directly to open.
So these were, that's a good question. I don't know in terms of whether they were converted to VATS and then to open. I think that this was definitely a conversion to open. So that's the conversion rate there. And we chose to look at that because I think it was hard to assess the numbers for the robotic to VATS. And that's what, and we have actually a poster there from our local institution from the University of Michigan where we did look at that. But I think for this type of administrative database, it was hard to get that data.
Yeah.
Given relatively small numbers, I mean, qualitatively, I wonder if you could screen both cohorts for the high-end users and the low-end users to get true median numbers to make sure nothing's warped by sort of high-end users, especially on the robotics side. So you take the top 1 or 2 VATS in robotics, screen them out, take the bottom 1 or 2, or just even 1, and make sure there's no bias that way.
So it's an excellent point. I mean, our goal in terms of looking at only surgeons who did more than 20 per year and count those, the goal was to eliminate at least the lower end on that. You know, we're not going to account for the people who are doing, you know, 100 robotic lobes a year. You're right, that's going to be the upper end of the cohort, and that's one thought process in terms of doing that. But again, what's your minimum number for competency, I guess, is the question. And so if you're doing more than 20 per year by either modality, whether it's VATS or robotics, and if there are other numbers that people have, I mean, we felt 20, and other people have used 20 as kind of a barometer for competency, at least in terms of doing that number per year. That's actually, I think, a higher number than some people would feel is needed. Fair enough. Yeah. Yeah.
The length of stay seemed quite long in most groups. That was the mean or the median?
That was the mean. So it was like 6.3 roughly in both. That's longer than our internal length of stay at our institution. I don't know about it, but that, again, an administrative database, and that's consistent with what other people have published, I think, in terms of the STS database still, even for VATS lobes. You would think it's smaller, but it still tends to be a little bit higher for whatever reasons.
Did you analyze all the data for all of the lobes rather than just the high-end users?
We have. I didn't present that here, but we have. Did you have a specific question about that? Or
yeah, because that shows reality more. You know, it's 10% of the lobes that were done by the high-end users, and 90% are done by people that weren't high-end users. So the reality of practice would be the entire cohort, not just the 10% of high-end users.
So it's an excellent point. Our goal here, though, was, again, to eliminate the learning curve bias and the low-end users, because I think that's where a lot of the differences are seen when you have a lot of surgeons who are doing low volumes, and then there are things like cost, OR time, things like that, that are always going to be higher in the people who are using it at lower rates. So we are looking at that, I think, in terms of a separate project. But our goal here was to primarily look at the high-volume surgeons.
I understand that, but so you don't have any of the information about the entire series, just the high-end?
I don't have it off the top of my head. I have it on my computer, and I can go over it with you later.
Okay. Because, again, that's reality, not just the surface of the world.
Agreed, but also not the point of what our manuscript is trying to say.
Okay.
Terrific. Thank you very much.
Thank you.